Hello, I am Karina.
And I'm Maddie.
And welcome to Everything But the Fairy Tale Sync. Today is apparently the day of really weird hellos. Today I went like a little Minnesotan. We're not going to question it. Alright, this week's episode is a follow-up to last week's episode, where we dive into more of the modern vampire legends. This episode will be a little different from most of our regular episodes. I mean, both of these kind of were, because we're not going to be looking at just the mythology and legends behind it, but also more of the cultural influence and honestly some sciencey stuff. We're not really going to do a catch-up today because we already did the catch-up last week and we are in the same clothes.
In case you can't tell by our clothing, we're filming on the same day.
Woo! We might be a lot more giggly in this one, just warning you now.
Yes, so this, like she mentioned, this is getting more into creatures and specific legends versus broad general information to help us understand this week's topic.
And Maddie, you finally get to find out what vampire pumpkins are.
Yes. Also, I would like to put a disclaimer in the Kelpies episode. So my headphones don't have one of those microphone boxes. So I'm holding my cord like this. So I look like an idiot in that episode. I don't have a mic box when I thought I did. So anytime you see me talking into my cord, that's just me talking into my cord like a dummy.
That's great.
Anyways, recommendations.
So my first one, my scripts are a little passive aggressive. I did write this at 1 a.m, so my recommendation
best time to get stuff done.
Oh, definitely. My recommendation is Julie and the Phantoms. Not because it connects at all to this episode, but because I want a second season.
Okay.
What is your
my recommendation is the book Kingdom of the Wicked by Carrie Maniscalco. I read it in 2 days. Karina's also read it. Brief explanation is this girl, her sister gets murdered and she has to figure out who did it, and she teams up with a prince of hell. Enjoy.
We definitely enjoyed. It also takes place in 19th century Sicily. So, kind of
for all you historical fans out there, read about murder and history and lots of food descriptions, so don't read when you're hungry.
But anyways, we can create a whole episode on how much we enjoy Carrie Maniscalco's books, but that is actually not what we're talking about today, unfortunately. Not unfortunately, though, because Maddie finally gets to learn what vampire pumpkins are.
Yay! Do you want to go ahead and give the content warning for this episode before we get into the actual episode
itself? To do that. Content warning: descriptions of dead bodies, mature discussions of violence and sexual activity. The modern word vampire was first adapted in written form into the English language in either 1690 or 1732. Reports vary. Linguists theorize its origins can be traced all over Central and Eastern Europe. Uber from Ukraine, vampire from Poland, vampire of Germany, and those are all possibly descended from the Turkish word uber, which is a type of vampire and or witch. Alright, we must begin with good old Dracula. One notion I'm going to dispel right away: the historical count and Bram Stoker's Count have almost nothing in common besides the name and their general location. So
I feel like no Dracula has anything in common with Vlad the Impaler anymore, because the things he did are not the things that vampires do now.
No. And we'll kind of get into why those connections are made later on. So we'll be discussing the historical Dracula first, which was Vlad III, also more commonly known as Vlad Tepes Dracula, who was the son of Vlad Dracul, or Vlad II, and he was the voivode of Wallachia, which Wallachia, by the way, is an area in Romania. And so Vlad is an extremely divisive figure. In the West, he is considered to be a monster. I mean, the moniker of Vlad the Impaler is given for a reason, and he was really fond of impalement, which is a particularly gruesome form of execution. The nicest comparison I can make is to a pig on a spit. But
I was going to say human shish kebab.
I was also thinking popsicle, but then
we're sorry to any people who like any of the foods we've mentioned.
Yeah, we tried. All right, but in Romania, to this day, he is actually considered a national hero. He was a highly influential member of the Order of the Dragon, which was dedicated to fighting enemies of Christianity, especially the Muslim Ottomans, and he is considered to be considered by descendants of his kingdom to be a just ruler and a necessary tyrant. However, whatever you think of him, he is undoubtedly drenched in blood, and there are actually stories, though it's unclear if it's from inside his court or because of Bram Stoker, of Vlad III being cannibalistic and or drinking the blood of his enemies.
See, right now I'm looking at my copy of Hunting Prince Dracula, and I'm like, interesting. Yes. Also,
we once again love Mary Maniscalco.
I was gonna say we love her.
All right, this is a great way to say I forgot what I was gonna say. But yeah, the Order of the Dragon in the second book, which I'm not going to go into much detail about because we don't spoil here, is actually really interesting once you start looking into the Order of the Dragon historically. And once again, makes me love her more because she obviously does her research, and she also made Thomas Cresswell, so a win-win situation. So when would you guess the height of vampire hysteria would be in history?
I'm so bad with dates, but honestly, most vampire things you see are like the 1800s, and you have these women in the big dresses. But I picture it being more like the Gothic era and or like early medieval times.
Okay, you were actually closer than I expected. So
I'm not stupid. Okay, well, I know my things. I know my random facts.
All right, so the height of vampire history comes later than I actually personally expected, which is between the 17th and 19th centuries. And when I say vampire hysteria, I mean the actual belief in vampires, not the cultural obsession with vampires. So in Eastern European town, revenants, which reminder is interchangeable with vampires, were blamed for ailments of all kinds, and the hunt for a vampire would ensue in the local graveyard. Telltale signs of a revenant include fresh blood on a grave or an incorrupt body. The corpse, which I will explain incorrupt later on, the corpse was promptly dealt with by a stake to the heart, burning, and or dismemberment. Interestingly enough, incorrupt bodies, a corpse that has no or very little visible decomposition, so in other words, a natural mummy, are usually connected to sainthood, especially in Roman Catholicism. However, to the Eastern European villagers, the bodies that refused to decompose naturally were considered evil or even satanic. This is likely rooted in the pagan influence in the area, which records of the ancient Slavic religion are unfortunately pretty lost to time because there were so many Christian conquests in the areas that their records got destroyed because it was an oral tradition. However, many of the creatures and fears seem to be rooted in the mythologies of the past. So this next part is a little bit on the grosser side, I'm going to warn now, but I'll try not to go into too much detail. So there were other types of bodies that were considered to be vampiric when they were on the hunt for a culprit. So there were bodies that would be extremely bloated and like to the point where they could explode. So that's fun. And we do know now that that's due to gas buildup in a corpse. But it's a really...
I was gonna say, most of these things that people are like, oh, it's a vampire, most of them are probably scientific things that can be broken down into pathology.
This is probably the most I will ever debunk myself during one of these episodes. We know that the exploding corpses and the bloated corpses were due to gas buildup, which is a natural phenomenon, though it is weird. And then there were also the chewing corpses, which appeared to chew off their own fingers. However, we know now that that was very likely due to maggots.
I would also like to point out, well, unless there was like scratches on it, it also could have been like they buried a very heavy sleeper. The very heavy sleeper tried to get out. There's documented cases of that, but I don't know. Bugs be nasty.
No, the chewing ones, basically, so I actually read about this in the Vampire Forensic books I recommended last week. Honestly happened more with like the Black Plague. Or the Black Death, not the Black Plague, but you know what I mean. They would start, the burial shroud would dissolve, and the fingers would dissolve at the same time, and the belief was that when they chewed those fingers, they were attacking a member of their family, and so they would shove a brick into the mouth of whoever was...
I love humans, but humans are so stupid.
Yeah, and
like,
so not to ruin the fun of imagining, like, malevolent bloodsuckers. I don't know if fun's the right word, but we're gonna say fun. Modern forensic science shows us that a lot of these cases were really due to a misunderstanding of decomposition. And during these times, understanding of mortuary practices were limited, meaning that many cases were just premature burial.
I mean, fingerprinting. I know a lot about true crime. Hello.
It's almost like it's your major.
But fingerprinting wasn't even really a thing until like the later half of the 1900s. So people used to bury really heavy sleepers. There's actually a Edgar Allan Poe poem on it. It's called The Early Burial. And this is completely true, where people were so scared of being alive, like being buried alive. Not scared of being alive. They would, the string through. And then if someone was buried and they're laying there and they ring the bell, and then someone hears and they're like, oh, shoot, we buried a heavy sleeper, and they dig them up. So
yeah, which I would like to clarify.
Understanding of death and decomposition has come a very long way, and I don't think we put bells in cemeteries.
We do not, because we can't actually test that they're dead. They did actually know at this time that these people were dead, because they would give it a few days, or even like up to a week, and they would perform all the funeral rites, which were extensive.
Which, fun fact, that's why we have the viewing of the body.
Oh my God,
seriously,
so dramatic.
No, that's why it's a thing. It's because people were so afraid that they'd bury a heavy sleeper that's why we have viewings at funerals, is to make sure that the person, it's a very old tradition to make sure that the person is truly dead. Very morbid, but that's why we have that.
Well, we're going to talk about actual dead people. All right, so we're talking about those premature burials, which I am clarifying is basically there wasn't enough done on the body to make sure that it would decompose naturally. So, which is a weird concept of like, oh, you have to do a whole process to make sure that this person goes through the natural process.
Morticians are very important. Don't think morticians are creepy. They're very important.
They respect your morticians because they're probably really nice people as well. All right, so corpses shift really naturally in the grave just because of like earth movements. And so one of the big things I mentioned earlier was they searched for fresh blood. That was very likely due to the corpse's own blood leaking from orifices, which I hate that word, but that's basically what happened. And then one of the signs of like, oh yes, we got the right one, was the corpse would scream when they staked it. This was usually because of air being pushed from the lungs up through the throat and through the larynx. So science. Despite all of the science that we have discussed already today, though, there are a lot of things still left unexplained, and because of this, along with just how deep-rooted suspicion is in parts of the world, such as Romania and Hungary, a lot of people still actually believe in these legends. I don't know if vampire hunts still happen. I personally would never want to see one, but to each their own. All right. There were a few surefire ways to rid yourself of vampires. Just gonna let you know now, this is one of my favorite discoveries I've ever made while researching.
Let's go.
So, some ways to get rid of vampires: bells, sunlight, bright light, a rooster's crow, garlic, peppermint, onions, silver bullets, and bullets
Okay. A rooster's crow.
Yes.
So this vampire, in my mind, I have roosters. I live in an apartment, but at my house I have roosters. So in my mind, I'm picturing this vampire doing the sneaky 1920s villain walk where he's on his tiptoes like this, and a rooster crows. The vampire freaks out and he runs. He's like, oh no, a rooster.
You know what? My brain said?
Rooster symbolized the sun rising?
Probably. And I was about to say that, but definitely my brain was just like imagining the rooster from Robin Hood, like sneaking up behind a very cartoonish vampire.
He aggressively plays his lute. And the vampire runs. And the vampire runs.
And then the last one I mentioned, which I can't say melted right now, but so bullets melted down from old bells, especially church bells. And in the most surprising twist of events, since finding out that Darth Vader was Luke's father, Count Von Count of Sesame Street is not that inaccurate, because vampires do in fact have an obsession with counting things.
Is that why they're... Okay. Wow. Tiny monkey brain was like, that's why they're called counts. And then I'm like, no, counts is an actual title of a human being, a count and a countess.
Yes.
That's not...
But I'm sorry, I'm still not over the fact, though, that Sesame Street apparently has a more accurate vampire than Stephanie Meyer.
Go Sesame Street!
But so, a really surefire way to make sure that you're never bothered by a vampire is to either put a fishing net over the entrance of any building you want to protect because they'll just stand there and try to count the holes. Another one is to scatter seeds on the floor, and they have to pick every single one up. Are you ready?
Is it vampire pumpkin time?
In a second. So, vampires are not always human. So the first example we're going to talk about is vampiric mermaids. So the vampire mermaids do enjoy killing for fun, and they will actually steal the breath, like, from your lungs instead of blood.
Vampire mermaids sounds like someone wanted to write a YA novel, but they wanted it to be supernatural. And they're like, okay, werewolves have been done, witches and all these things have been done. How about vampire mermaids? and the person, their editor, whoever, was like, yes, do it. And so, yeah.
Except it actually is based in mythology, which is the funniest part. And are you ready?
Yes. Yep.
Of course, we have my new favorite thing, the Romani vampire pumpkins. So this bizarre phenomena happens to other gourds and even melons, but the association of pumpkins to Halloween makes them the most famous. Though I gotta say, vampire watermelon sounds like a really, really bad band name from like 2000s Disney Channel. All right, I'm sorry, I keep laughing at my script. So a pumpkin that isn't consumed in the next 10 days, before Christmas or before the next full moon, is at risk of becoming a vampire. Now, not every pumpkin will become a vampire, just like every human won't become a vampire, but it makes it more at risk. So these pumpkins, luckily, are not nearly as lethal as their human counterparts. They feed off of your psychic energy. So they are sort of dangerous to anyone that struggles with mental illnesses such as depression or anxiety, and they can cause long-term harm, but like it's very rare because it takes a long time and you can usually catch them before it can do any real damage. And so the big thing with vampire pumpkins is that they can attract other malevolent spirits, so you do have to get rid of them quickly.
Okay.
And do you have go ahead.
This is really random, but yeah. I'm looking at my movies. Okay. Does anyone know that Scooby-Doo movie where Velma and Daphne and Fred all they get stuck in the Goblin King? They get stuck in the amusement park on Halloween, and Shaggy and Scooby have to go to the underworld and meet the Goblin King so that they can save their friends from the evil wizard guy. And there's Jack. That's what I picture, but more malevolent. So just this little pumpkin head, but more malevolent. Also, I thought I knew vampire pumpkins, but I don't. But I just know like the weird thing that I don't know how to explain it. And yeah.
It gets better. Because now we're going to get into how you catch one of them. Do you have any guesses?
If it's a vampire... I can't believe I'm saying this about a pumpkin. If it's a vampire, you put a stake through it.
Oh, no, I'm not talking about how you, get rid of it. I'm talking about how you even spot it in the first place.
Let me guess. It grows a face and sprouts some fangs.
No, it growls at you. Or, alternatively, it can develop splotches that look suspiciously like human blood.
That's it. Podcast is over. We're not doing any more episodes. This is it. We're ending.
This is the best thing ever.
We're ending on a high note and a low note at the same time. We're just no more episodes.
But yeah, so basically what I'm getting at, they are really, really easy to spot because, I mean, if your produce is growling at you, I'm throwing it out. But to rid yourself of this pestilent produce, plunge it in a pot of boiling water, and then you'll put the pumpkin on the ground and you'll break it apart with either a handmade broom or a branch, and then you discard of the weapon of choice and the pieces of the pumpkin.
So... Oh, the mental image I have right now is just someone boiling a growling pumpkin and then beating it with a broom. Like not the stick end of a broom, like the bristled end of a broom, standing at a distance, smacking the pumpkin until it falls apart.
Or alternatively, just grabbing a tree branch and just bam.
Why can't you throw it against a tree? You know when people like huck produce and I don't know.
I don't know.
Oh boy.
But yeah, so that's what you've been waiting for.
It was
happy?
It was worth the wait. It was worth the wait.
So, on a little bit more of a serious note, but also kind of getting into more of the cultural influence, we're going to talk about when the vampire became a sex symbol. So there is no doubt that vampires have always had a connection to human intimacy, but most legends warn of an abuse of power.
Does this have anything to do with neck biting? Because, like,
no, it does not have anything to do with neck biting.
I'm bad with dates, so when you say 16th and 17th century or whatever you said when the vampire...
17th to 19th.
That. My little brain doesn't know the dates of those eras, but you know, you have all the people with the high neck collars and the long sleeve things, and then you see all these vampires coming up and they're like, I'm gonna bite your neck.
Okay, we're not talking about necks anymore.
Wait, I have a joke.
You have been stopped.
What is a vampire's favorite fruit?
Blood orange.
A nectarine.
All right, so yeah.
Anyways, continuing on.
There is no doubt that vampires have always been connected to human intimacy, but most legends warn of an abuse of power because the act of feeding on a human being or the act of assaulting an innocent youth both classify as violations of consent. So the change can be traced back to Gothic literature. Woo, we're getting into the spookies. So, for example, Carmilla, which was published some 20 years before Stoker's Dracula, was the prototype for the lesbian vampire trope that was popular throughout the 20th century. And interestingly, one of the only examples of the gay part not being the villain part. However, the drinking blood part was a villain part. But, of course, we have to go back to the other Dracula, which was the fictional Dracula. One of the main arcs in Stoker's story, which I have not personally read, but I have read a synopsis of it. I will read it eventually, and I will let you know when I do. So, one of the main arcs in Stoker's story was the Count's pretty creepy desire for women, especially for Mina and Lucy. Like, to the point he became obsessed with taking a female victim. Over time, though, the vampire did become slowly and steadily more romanticized, and now they're both the debatably sympathetic heroes and creepy ghoulish villains of things like Twilight and the Vampire Diaries, as well as the deeply complex protagonists of stories like Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, which were adopted into Maddie's all-time favorite movie, Interview with a Vampire.
Okay, I'm sure the book is much better than the movie, but I watched the movie, and blonde Tom Cruise gives me nightmares, but also, they just talk like this all the time, and they aggressively whisper at each other. And it's really dumb, and it was bad, and it was 2 hours of my life I'll never get back, and oh boy.
I think I got through the first 30 minutes. I have a petrifying fear of rats, and the amount of rats in that movie.
That's not even the worst part of the movie!
But I couldn't get to the worst part of the movie because there were so many rats! Alright, but so a really interesting shift we have seen over time is that the vampire has become a symbol of both sex and wealth. The Gothic vampires were aristocrats, counts and countesses, and we see this continue with, for example, in honestly my favorite vampire thing, which is the originals. The original family is extremely wealthy, and we see the Cullens in Twilight are weirdly wealthy. I don't know how they have that much money. I don't know. I think every character in Twilight is better than Bella and Edward, and I would rather read a story about Alice. Anyways, another example from another one of my favorite things is Vladimir Academy and Vampire Academy. I almost said Vampire Diaries, but Vampire Academy, which is a very extravagant school for vampires of all kinds. Highly recommend that series. Shout out to Rochelle Mead, who we both love.
I've met her too. She's a very lovely lady.
Lovely. And she remembered us, which was quite nice.
Yes.
But so vampires are very famous in the iconography of horror, but they hardly resemble the stories of generations previous. And it's honestly surprisingly like a linear progression once you actually look into it. And that's where we're going to end our tale of vampires.
Darn. I think it's funny, so I'm a big horror aficionado. I love horror movies and psychological thrillers, but I don't know. Vampires is not something like I like vampires. I enjoy vampires, but they were never something I really got into. And so I couldn't Twilight, but I just think it's so interesting how they're always so wealthy and money, know? But also, they're either very young, youthful vampires. They're immortal; they don't age, whatever. But they're like either young, youthful, attractive men, or they're old, ancient, decrepit men. And there's really no in between.
So, very quickly before we end, I'm going to find a quote that I wrote down in my... Okay, so this is from Peter Nichols, who is the editor of the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, about the modern perception of a lot of the creatures we see. So, vampires are aristocrats, drinking only the most refined of substances, usually blood. In the iconography of horror, the vampire stands for sex. The werewolf, who stands for insatiability, shape-shifting, lack of self-control, is middle class and lives in a dog-eat-dog world. The zombie or ghoul, who shambles and rots, is a working class, articulate, dangerous, deprived, wishing only to feed off of those who are better off. In the iconography of horror, the zombie stands for the exploited worker. And I think that's really interesting, because when we look back in history, they were all so incredibly interconnected. And it's honestly an interesting cultural thing.
Well, like when you think about it, kind of going back to the vampires and werewolves and what you just said, vampires are always we see a lot more vampiric men than women in movies and stuff, just because young woman is seduced by sexy vampire. But they have the money, they have the class, they are, they have their suits and they're super wealthy and, they always look nice. And then it's like, oh, there's Gerald the werewolf over there. Yeah. And Gerald's like this scraggly man with a lump, in a flannel shirt, and he looks like he has no money or very little money. And it's just so weird. Like they're all just these supernatural creatures, but it's always been werewolves don't have money, vampires have the money.
I think this ended up being a much longer conversation than we expected, but it's a really interesting conversation and one I think we need to start having.
It is. It's interesting because, they used to be so similar, and they still have a lot of similarities, like I said last week, but...
Yeah, I think the point I'm going to end it on is we do tend to see the shift along with Gothic literature when there starts to be more of a class disparity. So, like, the French Revolution of 1789 really kicked it off, and then we begin to see, like, the battle between the proletariat and the working class, and then the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. I said proletariat and working class, I meant merchant class. And we start to see these different creatures take on different roles, which it's really interesting when you think about it.
Yeah, all right. That has been vampires and vampire pumpkins and a whole bunch of fun, delightful things. Tune in next week where I will discuss the Colorado urban legend of Riverdale Road. No, it has absolutely nothing to do with the CW show Riverdale.
No crappy version of the musical of Heather's here.
So it is a it's literally about a road, and the road is quite creepy. So join us next week. Yeah.
All right. So we're going to do our wishes before we sign off. Do you have a wish, Maddie?
My wish is that, I don't know. Oh, my wish is that when you're trying to go to bed, your neighbors aren't being obnoxiously loud.
Ooh, I could have used that last night. My wish is that we get more music from Taylor Swift. All right. Well, we are signing off. This episode was hopefully a lot more fun, a lot more lighthearted. Little more gross, not gonna lie. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Thank you for sitting through our discussion, and we hope that you have a wonderful day.
Thank you. I don't really have anything to say. Bye-bye.